Welcome to the New England Hemophilia Association's webinar on genetic therapy. My name is Brandon Green, and I'm NEHA's Communication and Marketing Manager. I'll be the moderator for tonight's webinar. The objective of this webinar is to provide you with more information about the history of genetic counseling while sharing some thought-provoking cases from the field. The goal is also to help you better understand how genetic counselors can help those in the bleeding disorder community. In addition, you'll learn how you can stay involved and be better informed as technology and therapeutics improve. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few webinar points and helpful hints. Tonight's webinar will last approximately 1 hour. We welcome your participation and questions. Your audio will be muted by the system for the duration of the webinar. If you have a question, we encourage you to use the question box on the bottom right of your control panel. I'll pass these questions along to Janelle at the end of the presentation. Our presenter tonight is Janelle Shea. Janelle spent the past semester as our intern here at NEHA. She's currently a student at Boston University's School of Medicine Master's Program in Genetic Counseling, and she also led a program at our recent Fall Fest. Janelle, I'd now like to turn it over to you. As a reminder, in order for you to advance, you'll be good to go. So Janelle.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that introduction, Brandon. And hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us on this Tuesday evening. I'm excited to talk to you about genetic counseling and kind of what that can mean for individuals in the bleeding disorder community. So as Brandon just mentioned, my name is Janelle, and I'm a Boston University student in their genetic counseling program. But I grew up on the North Shore, and I went to my undergrad on the South Shore, and now I'm in Boston. So New England is near and dear to my heart, and so it was an honor to work with the New England Hemophilia Association this past semester. And I'm really excited to be with you all tonight to tell you a little bit more about genetic counseling. So before we can get into even what is genetic counseling, it's important to take a few steps back and talk about what even are genetics and what is our genetic information. So this is a picture of a cell here, and we have millions of cells throughout our body. We have hair cells, eye cells, blood cells, and if you were to open up one of these cells, you'd see that these chromosomes, and these chromosomes hold the instructions or our DNA. The DNA is made the DNA contains all of our instructions to make those different cells in our body. And they're made up of a sequence of A, T, C's, and G's. So if we lay out all those letters, we'll get all of our information. However, it can, with that long strain of letters, it can be hard for the cell to be able to make sure they're making the right copies of it and that it's always in the right order. And that's where we can get different genetic variants or genetic changes. There are a lot of different types of genetic variants that can occur, so I just have a couple examples. So the first is a point mutation. This is when a single base pair letter is changed in the sequence. So here you can see that this T is changed to a C, and that change alone is what causes the Hello, can you hear me? Sorry, I think my computer got muted. Sorry about that.
Yep, you're all set, Janelle.
Okay, sorry. So back to the point mutation. So here you can see this T is changed to the C, which makes it not work as the protein that's supposed to be made not work as we would expect, and therefore can lead to different genetic conditions. The next type of variant is called a deletion. So this is when one or more of these letters gets deleted, and that causes the order in which they are read to change. So again, this deletion is going to change how it's read, and therefore the protein that's produced is not going to function as we would expect. So the impact of this deletion will depend on the genes that are involved, as well as where in the string of letters it is. However, we know that deletions can lead to genetic conditions as well. The next This type of change is an insertion. So we could have a situation where one or more letters are inserted to the sequence where they're not supposed to be, which would alter that reading frame and lead to what's called a frame shift mutation. And having the way that it's changed would result in how changing the genes function, and therefore could lead to different health conditions depending on where that is. And then the last type of variant I'm going to touch upon is a substitution. So this is when one or more of the letters that are inserted into are substituted out in the sequence. So this GAT is changed for this TGC, and that changes the way that the sequence is read, therefore changing the function of the protein that's created, and can lead to different things. So there are other types of changes that may occur, but those are just some examples that we might see and we might be talking about in a genetic counseling session with different people. So how did we learn all this information about this string of letters as well as what these mutations mean? And the answer is that we learned it through lots and lots of research performed by many dedicated scientists. So this is just kind of a timeline giving us the information, giving us when this information kind of came up. So it all started back in the way 1800s, which isn't even on here, but with Gregor Mendel, and he had his pea plants where he was trying to figure out how different colors of the plants and if the peas were wrinkly or not were being inherited. And then over time, we learned more and more information. So in 1910 was when we learned that these letters, the A, T, C, and G, is what makes up our DNA. And then there's a bit of a hiatus until the 1950s. It wasn't until 1953 that we identified what the shape of DNA is. And so we just learned a lot of this information over time. In 1983 was when the first single gene disorder was identified, with learning the gene that causes Huntington's disease. And then shortly after this began the quest to figure out what do all of our genes in our bodies mean. And that was the Human Genome Project, which sequenced every single letter in our gene and identified that we have over 20,000 genes as humans. So there's a lot of information that's in a very small amount of space. And in terms of genetic counseling, in 2008 was when next generation sequencing technology became available. And that's really when we were able to apply this to individuals who are looking for answers about what their genetic information means. And if we really take a step back, we went from learning the mere shape of DNA to being able to sequence these letters in a mere 55 years. So genetics has really been rapidly expanding and booming over the past couple of decades, and we're learning all sorts of information about how our bodies are made. So this is just to highlight that the 55 years that we've learned all of this information. So that timeline ended in 2009 with the development of cancer genetics, but where are we now in 2019? So first, we have more information about these genes than we ever had before, and how these changes in these genes could affect someone. However, we're nowhere near close to learning what all 20,000 genes, and so we have a lot more research to come and a lot more areas of the genome that we have to explore, but at this point, we know the most information we've ever known about it, which is an exciting time. In addition to this, the cost and time of sequencing have significantly decreased since the technology became available in 2008. So at first, this technology cost thousands of dollars to complete, but now at certain companies, you can send genetic testing and the most someone will pay is $250, depending on what they're looking at. So in 10 years, the price has drastically increased, which has changed how people are able to use and access this information. In addition to this, we're able to do more targeted testing by looking closer at specific genes of interest, but we're also able to do broader testing where we can look at all the coding regions in someone's DNA, depending on what people are interested in learning or what their indication is for their being referred to genetics. And perhaps one of the craziest things of all is that you can order genetic testing right to your door. So there's direct-to-consumer tests like 23andMe and Ancestry.com, where people can learn this information and have a kit sent to their house in order to learn more about their genetics. So overall, in the last decade, this information has become more available, more precise and accurate, and also easier to use. So here are just some of the recent genetics concepts in the news. So those are the direct-to-consumer testing companies like Ancestry.com and 23andMe. And I believe at 23andMe, it's about $200 to do your ancestry information as well as your health information. So this direct-to-consumer testing is doing a lot of good things for people, like helping confirm family traditions, like where they're from with their ancestry history and tracking down long-lost relatives. However, people are also getting a lot of information that they did not necessarily know they were going to learn about their health, and maybe they don't know how to fully interpret it. This is a Time article that featured Angelina Jolie, and it's called the Angelina effect, referring to when she was found to have a variant, and it's called the BRCA1 gene that increases her risk for breast cancer, and the decision she made in her own healthcare after that. And so this actually led to a significant increase in patients going to see cancer genetic counselors, which is interesting to think about how the media and how the news and things like that expose people to genetics and how that affects their own interpretation of their health. And then finally, this is a recent article about CRISPR technology. So it says the super precise new CRISPR tool could tackle a plethora of genetic diseases. And this is kind of getting along the idea of gene therapy. And this is really a hot topic in the world of genetics right now, where a lot of researchers are working on a variety of treatments using this technology for different genetic conditions. So it's exciting times in the world of genetics. So what do we do with all of this information? We know we have these 20,000 genes, and we have this long string of A, T, C's, and G's that make up who we are. But what do we do with all this? And that's kind of where genetic counselors can come in. So genetic counselors receive training in both medical genetics as well as counseling skills, and they work as a member of your healthcare team to provide the best care and make sure that all concerns are being addressed. So individuals get referred to genetic counselors based on their family and personal medical histories, and there we're able to provide education about genetics, the different testing options that may be available to them, as well as what those results could mean for them, and how we would use them to alter their healthcare management. In these genetic counseling appointments, we're also able to discuss current research and in some cases refer patients to things like clinical trials if that's going on in their area or we know of it in the hospital or something to that effect. But most importantly, genetic counselors are advocates for their patients in making sure that they're making informed decisions and have all the information available to them in order to make the decision that's best for them and their family at that time. So just to touch briefly upon the history of genetic counseling, it was born in the late 1960s, which was a time of great change kind of in general for the United States. So there were the recent assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr. and JFK, and they were in the middle of the feminist health movement as well as the civil rights movement. So there was just a lot of change that was occurring throughout the nation. And at Sarah Lawrence College specifically, where Melissa Richter was, she was the dean of students, and she was creating Sarah Lawrence's Center for Continuing Education. And this center was really aimed for women who stopped their education to start a family and now wanted to go back to school and continue on their path towards education. And so through the dedication of Melissa Richter and the circumstances of the times that came the birth of this field of genetic counseling. In 1979 was when the National Society of Genetic Counselors was formed, which is our professional society, and this was a big step for the field as it meant the field was being recognized and now had this larger support system within the healthcare community. And today, from that one program at Sarah Lawrence, in just 50 years, there's now 46 accredited programs in the United States where genetic counselors are being trained to be able to do these kind of services across all different specialties. So speaking of specialties, where are genetic counselors working? So for the most part, a lot of genetic counselors work in hospitals or in laboratories, kind of interpreting the genetic information that comes through. And they can also be working in universities, but they work in a variety of specialties as well. So the main three specialties are prenatal genetics, pediatric genetics, and cancer genetics, but genetic counselors are expanding into different areas like cardiovascular genetics and metabolic conditions, neurogenetics, and kind of finding different areas of expertise within all of those. just to provide some context of what a genetic counseling session looks like. So there are some main components that most sessions will go through, and the first is a risk assessment portion, and that's where we really go over the personal medical history and the family history and learn what different things look like they might be running in the family or different concerns that the patients might have. And then the next component is the educational portion. So that's where we talk about genetics in general, similarly to how we did in the beginning with that picture of the cell. That's actually a counseling aid that a lot of genetic counselors have used before in different sessions. And so we go over things like the inheritance pattern of the condition or that we're talking about, or the risks to other family members, and then the different testing options that are available and the pros and cons of those. But perhaps most importantly is that we support patients throughout the session and however we can to ensure that they're making an informed decision that's best for them, and also by providing emotional support. So in some cases they can be coming in when this is a really overwhelming time and they could be getting a lot of information from a lot of different physicians and care members of their care team. So genetic counselors really are the ones that we try to listen to whatever it is the patient needs at that time and then be able to help them the best way we can. And then finally, if testing is performed, then we can offer follow-up sessions where we talk more about what the results that came back mean and who in the family is impacted by these results. So now I just have some genetic counseling case examples. This is kind of just some scenarios that could occur and some things that I've talked about in different classes and things like that. So the first scenario is that there's a couple with a known hereditary cancer syndrome in the family, and they want to test their 5-year-old daughter. So some things to think about with this are that the majority of hereditary cancer syndromes are adult onset conditions, and kind of thinking about would the child want to know their genetic status. So this comes into play a lot with individuals who are under the age of 18 and maybe their parents want them to get testing, but maybe they're too young to even know what this testing means, and thinking about the autonomy of that person and would they want to get testing and know this information. So a genetic counselor can help by explaining that even if the daughter was found to have a variant in one of the cancer predisposition genes, her medical management and what we recommend that she do for surveillance and things like that aren't going to change until she's an adult, so there's no immediate need to do that. And then also kind of just going through the conversation that genetics is a really personal decision, and while the parents might want to know this information about themselves or their daughter, perhaps their daughter doesn't want to know. The next scenario is that parents opt to do exome sequencing for their child. One parent wants to learn about incidental findings while the other parent does not. So just for some background, the exome sequencing is a test that's performed when it seems like there might be an underlying genetic cause to whatever the symptoms are, but there's nothing pointing people to a specific condition. So they kind of look at all of the genes that make proteins in the body, and by looking at everything, there's a chance that we could find something that's not part of the original indication, and that's called an incidental finding. And these incidental findings can include things like genes related to cancer or cardiac syndromes. And so parents have to sign off for this, or children that are less than 18 years old. So some things to think about here is kind of exploring both of the parents' opinions and why one wants it and one doesn't, as well as how this information could affect their child in the future. Sometimes it's not well understood what it could mean, so kind of talking through that. And then, so how can a genetic counselor help with this? And that's really just by facilitating those discussions of coming to a compromise and understanding both sides, but being able to figure out whatever's best for their child. And then explaining more about the incidental findings and the different things that could be identified and how that would change the management for their child at some point in their life that's not necessarily now. The next scenario is that a parent feels guilty about passing on a genetic condition to their child. So things to think about here is that we don't control what are in our genes, and they're just there from birth, and we have no say over which ones get passed on and which ones don't get passed on. And so to go along with that, this information is not new, and we've always had it in us. So many families have this reaction and can feel this kind of guilt about this, but it's not something that any one person does. And so a genetic counselor can help by kind of explaining how everyone carries something in their genetic information, and now that we know about it is how we can adjust care in order to have it be the best it can be for the patient, and just kind of validating that it's okay to feel this way, but know that there's no one's fault, and just kind of reassuring the parents and now being able to take steps to manage whatever it is the condition is. And then this last scenario is an information-seeking, healthy individual without a family history wants to pursue genetic testing. So things to think about here is, if they're healthy right now, would knowing this information be more helpful or harmful for the individual? And kind of talking about the insurance piece and how if they're healthy and have no reason to be doing the testing, it's likely that insurance won't cover it. So that's another layer to discuss. And so a genetic counselor can help by facilitating that conversation about what would you do with this information, or how would it change how you're going about your life now, and then talking about implications for family members, because if they're a healthy individual seeking testing and something's identified, that could give us information regarding their siblings or children or parents, and maybe they want to know that information, but maybe their other family members do not. So those are just some cases that might come up, and we've talked a little bit about where we've been in the world of genetics, and we've talked about where we currently are, but where are we going as this field advances? So there's a lot of talk right now about moving in the direction of personalized medicine based on an individual's genetic makeup, and kind of making therapies or different management based specifically on an individual's DNA. And this is happening a lot within the context of cancer genetics, where certain changes in genes are known to respond to certain drugs better. So this is kind of what that picture up there is illustrating. But we're also moving into the world of gene therapy. So I touched upon this earlier with the CRISPR technology, but researchers are also working on how to use this with a variety of conditions, as well as a variety of different ways of delivering this technology. And so we went from just trying to look into the DNA sequence to now being able to potentially change that sequence or reduce the symptoms of certain conditions by reintroducing a copy of the gene that is working as we would expect. And in addition to this, we're moving into an era of preventative genetics, where seemingly healthy individuals are paying out of pocket. So look into their genes and see what they might have or might be predisposed to. So Brigham and Women's recently opened a preventative genetics clinic, and there are different clinics that are opening up across the country, and everyone's kind of calling it a different thing, and maybe it's predictive genetics or preemptive genetics, but it's a new kind of direction that the field is moving, which is interesting. So with all this progress comes a lot of questions, and those are both kind of logistical questions as well as ethical questions. So first is kind of, will the benefits of this technology outweigh the risks? And being able to kind of combine both of those and do whatever is best depending on if the benefits do outweigh the risks. And then also thinking about, how will researchers decide what conditions are worth the risk and which ones are not for introducing the risk of the gene therapy. And some of this technology utilizes viruses to insert the edited DNA, which of course comes with risk in and of itself. So we also don't know a lot about how the precision of this in humans, or if there are things like off-target effects that other areas would be impacted that we don't know about yet. So there are really promising case studies that suggest that these are really safe technologies. However, it's just something to think about as we continue to look into different conditions and different ways that this gene therapy can be delivered. In addition to this, it's interesting to think about how would gene therapy affect patient support and advocacy groups. So while some of these treatments are available for specific conditions, it's currently expensive for these types of treatments, and that can put a barrier to access. And so maybe some individuals will be able to have this treatment while others won't. And so it's how that might affect the dynamic of these different groups. And going off of this, so viral vectors are often utilized in these gene editing protocols. So things like HIV-related vectors can be used, and kind of thinking about the history of HIV with the bleeding disorder community and how that might impact someone's decision regarding gene therapy. Gene therapy right now for some bleeding disorders use other types of virus, which is a good thing, but just something to think about, as well as I mentioned previously, like access to this information. So it kind of talked about where we're going in genetics, but where are we going in the world of genetic counseling? So right now there's a big push towards telegenetics. So that would increase access to this service, as well as being able to provide it from anywhere and patients not having to travel for and things like that. So right now, 15.8% of geneticists reported using telegenetics, and that's now expanding into genetic counselors and kind of how we can utilize this to better serve different patients in different areas. And in addition to this, genetic counselors are expanding into even more specialties like neurogenetics and other areas that are now finding a little niche in, which is exciting for the expansion of the field. So some things to think about there are there certain scenarios where telegenetics might add more harm than good. So maybe they're revealing a positive result over a telegenetics consult isn't going to be necessarily beneficial for someone, because that can invoke a lot of emotion, and that can be harder to deal with over the computer or over the phone than it can be in person. And just how the skills learned in graduate school for genetic counseling can be applied to these different specialties, and kind of being able to best apply them in different areas and be able to help a broader range of individuals. And so just that's exciting time to be learning about this field and to be learning about genetics and all the different things that are happening. So where can you turn for resources about all of these changes and this information? So the National Society of Genetic Counselors has a website, and on there you can go to find a genetic counselor, and you can search in your area or specialty and find individuals that you can schedule appointments with or be referred to, as well as they have postings about current research articles and things like that. So that could be a good resource, as well as the National Institute of Health puts out the Genetics Home Reference, and this provides information regarding a variety of genetic conditions, what causes them, different management and treatment for them. And this is something that is easy to read and follow, so this is a great resource. But really the best thing you can do for resources is to be a part of the Wicked Strong family and the New England Hemophilia Association. We, as genetic counselors, one of the main things that we like to do is refer patients to these support and advocacy groups, because being connected to a community like this and having that support is truly invaluable. And so you're already doing the best thing you can for your resources by doing things like tuning into this webinar. So thank you for that. So just in summary, genetic information is both powerful and overwhelming. So we're learning a lot about this information, and we have a lot that needs to be decoded in here, but it's kind of interesting all the things that we can do and the different health changes that can occur by knowing this information. And genetic counselors are these healthcare providers that can help distill all of this information and aid in the shared decision-making process. So really talking through individuals' options and what they can do with this information, and whether or not this is a good decision for them at this time, or if not, if they should wait, and things along those lines. Genetic counselors are also advocates for the families they work with, and that's really why most people get into the field of genetic counseling, is to be able to work with families and to support them in whatever way we can. And then, as I mentioned before, being a member of this Wicked Strong family is the best thing that you can do in order to have that support and be a member of this community. Is truly incredible and really is invaluable. So thank you. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to ask them. I have some genetic trivia things we could do after if anyone's interested, but I know that's kind of hard to do over the computer. So yeah, does anyone have any questions?
All right. So as a reminder, everyone, if you have any questions, you can submit them on the bottom right of your control panel. But we already do have two questions here. Janelle, the first question that we have is, what are the pros and the cons of doing direct-to-consumer testing like 23andMe?
So that is a great question. I think some of the pros can be, it's fun to find out like the ancestry information, and a lot of people have found relatives from that or been able to confirm, like it comes back that they're Italian, and that's something that's really important to them, so they're able to kind of celebrate that. But sometimes with the health information, they only look at what's called common variants in those certain genes. So say with like the breast cancer genes, they are looking for specific mutations in there. So if it comes back like that's negative, there could be some change in another part of the gene that this testing isn't necessarily looking at. So sometimes it can kind of be a reassuring thing when maybe the test didn't kind of look at everything, but that can be hard to know without any interpretation of that. So sometimes people just recommend bringing that information to your doctor and kind of being able to talk through that, and they might know what was actually looked at specifically and be able to better explain that. As well as sometimes that can just be a lot of information for people. So kind of thinking about maybe before sending it in, do you want to know about all your risks, all the different conditions that 23andMe is able to test for, or Ancestry, or any of these direct-to-consumer testing?
Awesome. The next question that we have is, how do preventative genetic clinics work?
So that is a interesting question. So right now, this is kind of a new field, and there are different preventative clinics kind of popping up all over. Some are doing it where they're doing it on a research basis. Others are doing it where patients just have to pay out of pocket for this testing because, as I mentioned before, there's not a lot of insurance coverage for things like this when healthy individuals are trying to get genetic testing. But every clinic kind of has their own different models. So it'll be interesting to see how, as this field kind of progresses with the preventative genetics, if there'll become more standardization of these preventative clinics and kind of more regulations placed on them for how they go about ordering these tests and like which tests they choose. So it'll be interesting to see kind of how that expands.
Awesome. Well, everyone, thank you for joining us tonight and attending tonight's webinar. A recording of this webinar in its entirety will soon be added to NEHA's YouTube channel. The webinar will also be posted on our social media pages and on our webinars page under the resources tab on our website. NEHA has many upcoming events that we hope you can attend, and to see a full list of them, please visit our website at nehemophilia.org. Thank you to Janelle for your work leading this webinar tonight, and for all of you for attending. Have a great night.